give a little bit of an overview and a retrospective of pollinator research in blueberries. I think there's going to be a winter meeting coming up, and myself or Janelle, my PhD student, will do a more research-based talk at that time. A lot of this, I think, will probably be a little bit familiar to you. I hope some of it is familiar to you, but I think that's a good thing as well. And as I was preparing for this talk, I read this paper by Gordon Kinsman, this book by Gordon Kinsman. Never had the pleasure of meeting the man, but this is a great book. I hope many of you have it, and if you don't have it, I hope you get it. And he said, the greatest mistake made by the contemporary generation is that we do not read the minutes from the last meeting. And in that spirit is how I'm giving this talk here today. I think there's a lot of value in reflecting on what's been done and refreshing our memory and kind of relearning if we haven't learned it before. So from that book, Kinsman says that inadequate pollination is probably the most common cause of poor yields of blueberries in Nova Scotia. And I don't know if that's still true. I'm not sure if it's true all the time, but I think it's certainly true a lot of the time. Blueberry producers deal with a lot of challenges. You're dealing with insect pests and weeds. You are dealing with weather. You are dealing with fluctuating markets. But pollination certainly is a foundational service that you need. If you don't have good pollination, you're not going to have any blueberries. So I think a good place to start, because there is so much nuance to the wild blueberry system, to understand a little bit about the botany and the plant system. Pollination in lowbush blueberry is not like pollination in canola or almonds or even apples. It's much more complex, which makes it really interesting, but also really frustrating if you're a grower. So blueberries need insects for pollination. Unlike a lot of plants, a lot of important crops like wheat, like corn, like our conifer trees, like our deciduous trees, they can rely on wind. That is not the case for blueberries, okay? Blueberries have certain anatomical features that make them need insects. They have these things called porocidal anthers, and anthers are parts of the flower that actually release the pollen. And in the case of blueberries, they are built kind of like a salt shaker, so they actually have to be shook in order to get the pollen out. The plant tends to have flowers that hang downward, so they're not very well adapted to wind pollination. If you want your pollen to blow around in the wind, you should have your flowers kind of sticking up more. And the pollen is quite heavy. Blueberry pollen is often referred to as a tetrad. So it's this kind of, these 4 subunits that make up a pollen grain that's quite heavy, and that necessitates pollination by insects. And there's a lot of ways that pollen can move around. The insect is not there to pollinate your flowers. The insect is there to get food. The pollen serves as a protein source. The nectar serves as a sugar source. And it's only completely by accident that pollen gets moved from flower to flower. And that pollen can move, oops, went the wrong way here. Too many buttons. The pollen can move within a given flower. So a bee can be in a flower, they can get pollen on their body, and that pollen can move from the anther of that flower to the stigma of the very same flower, as we can see right here. Okay, that's kind of a self-pollination situation. The bee can move pollen from one flower to another flower, but that pollen can be moved on the same plant, or it can be moved in different plants. And that has ramifications for pollination success in wild blueberry because it is such a complex crop. So blueberries, as you know, or you should know, are clones. And a clone is an individual plant. So when you have a clone, those stems that are sticking up are multiple stems from the same plant. And that clone can range in size, right? It can range in size from the size of a coffee table or to the size of your living room or half the size of a bungalow. So there's a lot of variation in clone size. A lot of those clones are self-incompatible, okay? If the pollen from a flower in one clone goes to a flower in the same clone, it's fertilizing itself. And most often, about 57% of the time, that will result in non-viable fruit. Okay? Like any organism, a blueberry wants to outcross. It wants to get its pollen going to different individuals. And because of that, interclone pollination is usually needed. Pollen should move between one clone to another. And that can be an issue when you're dealing with insects. So this is a paper by Lindley Jessen's lab. She used to be at UMB. And what you can see here, this is the distance moved by a bee between flowers. So think about a bee in a blueberry field going from flower to flower to flower. In most cases, that bee is moving only about 20 to 30 centimeters or so. In the case of a bumblebee, she will often move about 70 centimeters. So she'll go from one flower to another flower at about 70 centimeters. A honeybee is a little bit closer, 50 centimeters between flowers. But the point is that remember that these clones can be 25 meters square. So quite often a bee is moving pollen around within a clone. And that can be a problem because a lot of clones are self-incompatible. And if that pollen lands on a flower, it's not going to produce a fruit. We do know, however, that some clones are self-compatible, and these tend to be earlier bloomers. And some nice work done by Frank Drummond. Frank Drummond, unfortunately, retired a little while ago, and he's just been a tremendous asset to blueberry entomology. Here we see that the proportion of self-fertilization that can be viable is much greater in earlier clones. So those clones in your fields that tend to bloom earlier, they are more self-compatible. So if a bee moves pollen around within that single clone, it's probably pretty good. Other issues with blueberry pollination is that a lot of clones don't produce very much pollen. So there's often not that much pollen to go around in some cases. Often the flower receptivity is very short. So after a period of about 3 or 4 days, the age of a flower that is, after about 3 or 4 days, even if pollen is deposited on a flower, it probably won't produce a very good fruit, if a fruit at all. So there's a pretty short window from when a blossom opens up to when it is actually receptive. And then you got different species. This is one of the things about dealing with a wild plant. In some fields, there are as many as 4 different species of wild blueberries. In most cases, you've got 2, right? You've probably got in your own fields Vaccinium angustifolium and this other one, Vaccinium myrtleoides. These are different species. So if pollen from one flower lands on the flower from another species, it's not going to produce a fruit, as we can see right here. So this is just a simple experiment we did. You got 2 different clones, 2 different species of wild blueberry. And when you cross the pollen in those, you can see right here, if you outcross between 2 angustifolium clones, so 2 members of the same species outcross, that's good, right? You get fruit set, you get berries. But if the pollen happens to be carried from a bee from a angustifolium to a myrtleoides, 2 different species, you don't get any fruit set, or you get very low fruit set. And if you self them, if you move the pollen within a single clone, you don't get any fruit set either. So how the pollen is moved amongst clones and between clones is very significant in blueberry pollination. And then we have this fact that fruit set is usually pretty mediocre. And that's okay, and that's actually pretty normal. Lots of plants produce more flowers than they produce fruit, right? They'll invest a lot in floral reproduction, and they'll get less fruit. And that's what we have in blueberries as well. This is some work done by a former PhD student of mine, Andoni Melithopoulos, he's now a professor at Oregon State University. And he did a lot of this work in Prince Edward Island. And you can see here, looking at the number of flowers per stem, we're around 30 or so, but by the time you get the fruit set, you're down to only 10. So there's only about 30% fruit set that's actually occurring. A little bit better in 2014, about 50% fruit set here. The difference between this value, the number of flowers, and the amount of fruit set in those flowers. And this is seen by others. Again, Lindley Jessen's group at UMB, even when you do supplemental pollination. So this is pollination by hand, where you can take a little paintbrush and you can actually move the pollen from one flower to another flower. You never get much more than 60% fruit set. Frank Drummond found very similar things in Maine, only about 40–50% fruit set. Okay, so 40 to 50% fruit set for wild blueberry pollination is pretty good. If you get more than that, it would be considered excellent. Okay, so I'm going to spend most of my time talking about bees, but there are other insects in your fields, of course, right? And it's possible that they could also move around pollen. I know you all love black flies. They don't do any pollination. So as my grandmother would say, they are good for nothing. And you can see right here, this is work done by Fiona Hunter, who's a professor at Brock University, and she worked in the pollination system in blueberries in Ontario, did some cage studies, and you don't get anything happening with black flies. So they're only out there causing problems for you, not contributing to your crop at all. But there are other insects that can contribute, and some of you may have seen this before. This is some work that we did several years ago. I was inspired by this paper that I stumbled upon completely by accident by Jeremy McNeil, who is a former mentor of mine who passed away a little while ago, a real giant in entomological circles, even internationally. He was very well known. And he worked in cloudberry, did a little study in cloudberry, which in Newfoundland we call bake apple. And what they found was that nocturnal pollination was responsible for about 41% of the fruit set. So this is pollination that's happening at night, which made me wonder, well, maybe there's pollination happening in blueberries at night. Did I do something wrong? No. No, so I wanted to investigate whether pollination in blueberries is happening at night as well. And we set up these simple cages right here, and we simply left them open 24 hours a day. We closed them 24 hours a day, or left them open only at night or only during the day. And what we found is that we get significant, this is the cages that are only open at night. And if you look at fruit set, you get significant fruit set of flowers when they're only open at night. And it's quite comparable to fruit set that you get whether it's open all day long or only during the daylight period. And you can see here when we have the cages completely closed, you have very low fruit set. There was some, because I think some of the blossoms were already open and there's things crawling around in there that can move the pollen. But the point is that there are things flying around at night that can pollinate your crop. And when you look at the insects that are out there, and we collect them at night, and we collect them off blueberry plants at night, you see there's a significant amount of pollen being carried by these little weevils. You get different moths, you get different flies, you get things like ichneumonids, which are parasitic wasps. They're biological controls that need nectar, so they're probably getting into the flowers as well. So there's a significant amount of pollination that is also happening at night that is not due to bees, which do not fly at night. But the bees are certainly the most important, right? And I think most of us should be familiar with the usual suspects, things like bumblebees and honeybees and cavity nesting bees and ground nesting bees. These are all really significant players in the yields that you will achieve. I'm going to first talk about the wild bees, and there are lots of them out there. And you should appreciate them, and you should try and do as much as you can to try and conserve and boost them. We did a fairly thorough study several years ago where we looked at a bunch of different fields in Nova Scotia, and we found almost 100 species of wild bees in blueberry fields. In Nova Scotia in its entirety, there's probably 200 species of bees. So half of the bees in Nova Scotia are found in blueberry fields. And when we look at where they are and when they happen to occur, Don't worry too much about these details. These are just different species. But if you look at the date here, and this shaded area is the bloom period, you can see that there are certain species that are quite prominent during the bloom period, like this Andrena carolina, which is a ground nesting bee that is just fantastic at pollinating blueberries. And you get other ones that are, somewhat present, and they tend to come around more later in the season. I think these bumps here are partially a function of the fact that when the blueberries are in bloom, they are in the bloom and they're ignoring our traps. And when the berry was no longer blooming, then they went to our traps, which I think is a partial function there. But the point is that they're there all year long, and they tend to be around during bloom period. This is also a small font here, but this is the distance from the field edge down here. So we collected bees at the field edge and up to 200 meters into the field. And what you should notice is that most often you get the larger parts of the bee community around the forest edge, around the edge of your field. And as you increase the distance away from that forest edge, the population of bees goes down. Okay, so here we're dealing with distance from the field edge, and the bee population tends to go down. So that natural habitat around your field is, not surprisingly, very important for establishing a rich bee community. And we also found that there's a function of size. So bees are not different from airplanes. A small airplane doesn't travel very far. Something like a 787 or a jumbo jet can travel very far. And bees are the same thing. And here we see that there's a relationship between size and the distance that they are able to move from the field. The bigger the bee is, the more able it is to fly out into the middle of your fields. So there's lots of them out there. They're out there in your fields, and we know that they're very good pollinators as well. And there are several studies that have looked at this sort of thing. I've looked at it, but I think the best one is by Steve Javrick and his group about 20 years ago now, or a little over 20 years ago. They did an excellent study that's been well cited by people all over the world, has cited this study. And what Steve showed is that when you look at different managed bees and compare those to wild bees that are out there, the wild bees on a per visit basis tend to be more efficient pollinators. So if you look at something like the flower visiting time per minute, so this is the amount of time that a bee spends moving from flower to flower. And obviously you want a bee to be quick, right? Pollinate, move quickly to the next flower. And bumblebees, over a period of a minute, will go to a dozen or so flowers, whereas something like a honeybee, only about 2/3 of that. The difference, of course, with honeybees is that they have sheer numbers, and what they lack in efficiency, they make up for the numbers of individuals that they have. If you look at something like the amount of pollen that's deposited, again, bumblebees are able to carry around these large tetrads and will deposit about 50 of those tetrads per visit, whereas a honeybee will only deposit about 11 or so of those. Okay, so a lot more pollen is deposited on the stigma. And as maybe Dr. Percival mentioned this morning, that's significant because the more pollen that lands on a stigma, the more ovules that can be fertilized in that developing fruit, and the larger that fruit will become. So the amount of pollen that's moved is significant. And finally, if we look at the success rate, we again see that things like bumblebees and the Andrena, that's the soil nesting bee, have very high success. So they visit a flower, and almost 100% of the time you get a good pollination. Whereas for something like a honeybee, only about a quarter of the time does it get good pollination. But I'm not trying to suggest that honeybees are not good, because again, there's so many of them that they make up for that difference in efficiency. And we know the habitat is really important for those bees. And as I mentioned, we should be doing as much as we can to conserve and bolster those communities that are out there. My student, Rob McCallum, who probably a lot of you know, former student of mine, she studied habitat management around blueberry fields and different wildflower mixes. and found that these can conserve and boost the populations of bees, but also natural enemies. So there are a lot of the good insects that you need around your blueberry fields that will also hang out in those wildflower mixes and contribute to pest control. Robin also looked at cavity nesting bees. And she created these nesting blocks, and some of you probably have them in your fields. You can take milk cartons and stuff them full of straws, and there are actually bees that will go into those crevices and nest. There's another type of bee that you can take these terracotta lids and just turn them over in your field, and the bee will actually nest under that terracotta lid. And sure enough, when you put them out in your field, there's significant uptake. So here we're looking at the total number of capped nesting tubes. And when that tube is capped, that means it's full of eggs and it's full of young bees that are going to develop and be in your blueberry fields. Sorry, I feel like I'm ignoring this side of the room, but pointing this way too much. I want to show this slide as well. Because habitat can be right in the field. This is a picture taken by one of Frank Drummond's former students down here. And all of these spots that you see here, these are Andrena nesting aggregations. Okay, so this is a soil nesting bee. This is a blueberry field that was pruned by burning, and it then just became peppered with Andrenids that are nesting right in the field. And of course, those bees will come out and then pollinate the crop in a couple of years. But it just illustrates the idea that right in your blueberry fields, you have bees nesting, or at least hopefully you do. Robin's done work with complementary plantings around blueberry field, and Frank Drummond and his group again has done it as well, creating these things that are called pollinator reservoirs. And what these consist of are strips of either wildflowers or clover or just natural regeneration. So spaces that were about, I think it was probably 3 meters by about 25 or 50 meters. And what they found is that different bees love those reservoir areas next to your field, but not all bees like the same thing. Okay, so if you look at something like a bumblebee, it really likes the clover. Not so much the natural regeneration in the wildflowers. If you look at a honeybee, it really likes the clover, not so much the natural regeneration areas and the wildflower areas. You have different solitary bees that prefer the wildflower areas. So there are different things you can plant that will be conducive to different types of bee. There's not a one size fits all. But whatever you plant, you can expect, we hope, to get some benefits from it. Okay, so this is the number of bees found on blueberry blossoms in areas adjacent to a control or a pollinator reservoir. So where you have these areas dedicated to boost that wild bee population, you actually get more bees on your blueberry fields. And that can translate into greater fruit set, as you see right here. You get a significant increase in the amount of fruit set in the blueberry fields that were next to these pollinator reservoirs. It can take a little bit of time. It can take 2 or 3 years before you start to reap the benefits, but it can have benefits for the crop, and it can have economic benefits. Okay, for time, Peter? Okay, so let's get into the managed bees. And Kinsman, again, in that book, The History of Lowbush Blueberry in Nova Scotia, pointed out that wild bee populations, although they're really important, they fluctuate a lot, right? That's not surprising. And therefore, it would be very wise to supplement that natural pollination force with honeybees. And there are certainly a lot of benefits to putting honeybees in or around your fields. And again, this is kind of a retrospective talk, so I went back into the literature, and some of the earliest peer-reviewed literature on this anyway is back in the 1950s, 1960s. And I came across this paper by G.W. Wood, who was a horticulturalist at the Department of Agriculture in New Brunswick. And he did some work looking at honeybees, different densities, 1, 2, or 3 colonies per hectare, and found that for a couple years there was no effect. Honeybees didn't seem to have an effect on the amount of fruit set. So these numbers right here just mean that there's no difference between the control or whether you had honeybees. But in 1959, there was a significant effect. Okay, so you can see right here, this number right here, this p-value, I think Scott referred to it, just means that there was more fruit set where you had honeybees versus where you didn't have honeybees. So there can be a benefit of honeybees. This was like 70 years ago. But Dr. Wood noticed that there was a significant variability in fields, significant variability in clones, significant effects of weather, differences in the bloom period across those years as well. And all of those things can affect pollination success. In another study, this one was done in Quebec back in 1996, Arras and co-authors. They placed 500 honeybee colonies at one end of a massive field that was about almost 7 kilometers long. So bees were all stocked at one end. Not surprisingly, they found that you get a decline in the numbers of honeybees that are found. As you go further away from the hives, the numbers eventually start to go down. That was not the case with native bees. So native bees were found all throughout the field pretty evenly, although there was a difference in the numbers of native bees. You're getting lots of honeybees. So this is the number of honeybees per 2 meters squared. This is the number of native bees per 2 meters squared, right? So the addition of honeybees really increases the pollinator force that is out there. And that translates into better fruit set and better berry weight. If we look at this top figure right here, this is the percent fruit set. This line looks pretty flat and not that impressive, but it's a bit of a logarithmic function. If you look at the number right here with 0 honeybees, you've got about 10-ish or so, okay, 10% fruit set. Whereas if you go up to about 20 honeybees, you get about 20% fruit set. So the addition of honeybees actually doubled the amount of fruit set that was happening. And when you look at the mean berry weight, it tripled the berry weight. Okay, so again, there's definitely benefits to adding those honeybees. You get increased fruit set and you get increased berry weight. In 1997, Leonard Eaton and John Murray, is Leonard or John here? Probably not. They published a study where they looked at the effect of honeybees over 5 years in all the maritime provinces and in the state of Maine over a total of 107 fields. And what they found is that honeybees definitely contributed to fruit set and the numbers of berries that were produced. I've just highlighted down here the numbers for 1994-95, but you can see there was a significant positive correlation. When you had honeybees, you got better fruit set, you got better berries. And there was no correlation with these other bees. There was no effect of the numbers of bumblebees and solitary bees on fruit set and numbers of berries. And they noted that where they had at least 5 hives per acre, that's where they noticed the greatest yields, although they also noticed that there was considerable variation. Okay, so some fields adding the honeybees really boosts things, other fields, not so much. A follow-up study done by Dr. Eaton and Billis Nams, who was another colleague of ours in our department, looked at over 500 fields over 5 years in Nova Scotia and looked at the effects of honeybees. And they found that as well, there is a relationship, but it wasn't quite as strong. The addition of honeybees certainly increases yield, but you can see here there's a tremendous amount of scatter, a tremendous amount of variability. And there was a detectable effect at about 1.6 hives per acre. So up to a point about 1.6 hives per acre, you see a positive benefit of adding the honeybees. Whereas beyond that, there's just, at least in this model, there's just too much variability to be able to detect the difference. And they also found a leveling off effect of bees. So once you have about 12 to 15 bees in your plots, you start to see a constant upward effect on yield, but after that point, you don't see much of an effect. So it seems that if you have around 12 to 15 bees in an area, and these areas were 1 by 20 meter plots over a 5-minute count, you see positive effects on yield. So honeybees, you get variability because of the variability in the system we have, but they certainly have positive effects on yield, fruit set, and berry production. So how do bumblebees compare? Again, I'm just kind of cherry picking certain studies for this talk. Dr. Frank Drummond and his group did a study with comparing bumblebees and honeybees. So in the figures I'm going to show you, they had a constant density of honeybees, about 3 colonies per acre, but variable densities of bumblebees. And what they found was you get greater percent berries when you have bumblebees, but that was the only difference. In all other instances, as you can kind of look at these figures, comparing honeybees in the white and bumblebees in the black, you see these letters, as Scott alluded to, they're all the same, A, which means that there is no difference in the effect of bumblebees and the effect of honeybees on things like fruit set, the mean number of berries, the weight of those berries, etc. So bumblebees and honeybees are quite comparable. And in a follow-up study, they found the same sort of thing. The addition of honeybees and bumblebees looking at fruit set, mature berries, berry weight, quite comparable. If you have a quad of bumblebees per acre or 3 to 4 honeybee hives per acre. Kind of gives you the same amount of fruit set, same number of mature berries, as opposed to what you see with wild bees. You can see the number is significantly lower. So by not having those commercial pollinators, your fruit set and your berry weights go down. Getting to the end. So we know that bees are important. We know that honeybees and bumblebees can work. But it's important to realize as well that other management practices are key, right? Pollination is only the first step, or one of the first steps in a long chain of events. After pollination, you've got to have actual fertilization of the ovules. You've got to have the right compatibility of the plants, soil fertility, pest management, the weather, harvest schedules, all that stuff affects your yield. And to look at those interactive effects, this is another experiment that Andoni did during his PhD work. He wanted to look at the effects of pollination at high and low levels, plus or minus the addition of pesticides. So in these different treatments, and we had caged experiments because we wanted to have control over the pollination. In some of the plots, you can see right here, we added recommended rates of insecticide and fungicide, and other ones we didn't have any. We also had different amounts of pollination. In some of the plots, we had full pollination, 100%, and in others, we only had 25% pollination. And what we found is that pollination is important, but its benefits are only really realized if you've got other good management practices, like applying fungicides and applying insecticides. If you look at the amount of fruit set right here, the yellow bars represent situations where pesticide was added. The white represents situations where no pesticide was added, and the size of the bumblebee box indicates the amount of pollination, high pollination or low pollination. And what you see is that if you have high pollination right here, you don't get good fruit set unless you have full inputs of pesticides. So the benefits of the full pollination are only realized when you have good pest management. And even in situations where you might have less pollination, if you have good pest management, those fruit can actually be bigger. So the plant will compensate for the lack of fruit set and actually make the berries that are produced of larger size. Okay, so good pollination only works if you have other good management practices. So the last thing I'll talk about is figuring out how many bees you need. And this is where I think there's a little bit of a gap in our knowledge. Certain rules of thumb have been suggested, and they maybe have not been tested that rigorously. So, and I've got in quotes here, these are just names that I came up with. If you look at Gordon Kinsman's book, again, he says that, if you're out in your field and you see 1 bee per square meter or square yard on a good sunny day, that should give you good pollination, right? Another rule of thumb about the pollination force is something that I've called hives in step. If somebody's got a better name for this, let me know. So you essentially go out into your field, and we don't need to worry about the numbers too much, but if you're not seeing any bees, then you've got a pollination problem, and you've got to add some hives. If you see, 1 or 2 bees out in your field, then maybe you should be adding 1 or 2 honeybee hives per acre. And if you've got 2.4 or so bees per meter squared over a 5-minute period, then you've probably got adequate pollination already. Another rule of thumb is what I've called the Drummond berry predictor. And this is from a fact sheet. You guys can all get it online, fact sheet number 629. Okay, and what Frank did for this predictor is he had a constant variable and different values associated with honeybees and wild bees, native bees that were in the field. And remember that I said native bees are more efficient, right? So they've got a different value than the honeybees. I don't have the data here. We did some tests of this predictor model, and it wasn't that great in terms of predicting the numbers of berries. So I think that there's a good opportunity to have a different model for predicting managed bees. We should at least be testing the current models that are out there. But I think one of the limitations of these models is that they only work during bloom. So for these models to get a sense of your pollination force, it's happening when your blueberry crop is in bloom. And by that time, it's too late to call up a beekeeper and say, hey, I need more bees. What you would like to do is to be able to predict your pollination force before the honeybees go into your field. So I think models that can predict the wild pollination force and use that as a proxy for the numbers of honeybees that you might need could be a valuable resource. So in conclusion, I think there's lots of evidence over the last several decades that wild bees are significant contributors and that we have good methods to try and boost and conserve their populations. We know that honeybees and bumblebees are absolutely awesome pollinators of wild blueberries and that adding them to your fields can increase fruit set and yield. We know as well that there's a lot of variation within fields, across fields, and from season to season. And this can really throw questions of pollination success up in the air a little bit. And that we have some models to predict pollination force, but those probably need a little bit more refinement. And with that, thank you for your attention. And lots of people have helped with research over the years, including the blueberry producers in Nova Scotia. Thanks.
So we've got time for a couple questions, actually.